do that thing. It is where they do it on they have a church software. It's called.
What thing? Which thing in particular? Oh.
Where they text.
Oh. No. Good morning. Hey, Mike. Good morning. I hate to, as always, I hate to break up the fellowship going on in here, because that's some of the best, but we have a lot of things that we're going to talk about this morning. As always, I have prepared way too much stuff to talk about. As we get going this morning, really good to be back up here with y'all. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. So we're getting ready to dive into. We're going to dive into the book of Daniel. This is going to be my first foray into an Old Testament book, and I chose the book of Daniel because I just finished reading it and I was up on it. I'm ready to go, right? But as we begin this Bible study, just like as you begin any Bible study, we got to remember the most important thing that we're doing in here, right? Everything that we study, it doesn't matter if it's Genesis, if it's Revelation, if it's anything. What is the purpose of this Bible study? And that is to point us all towards Jesus, right? That is it. That's the purpose of a Bible study, is to draw us closer to Jesus in our walk and as we follow Jesus. That's the purpose of a Bible study. It's also important to remember as we get started the three most important things in a Bible study. That is, number one, context. Number two is context. And number three is context, right? We always say that there's not a single book in the Bible that was written to you, right? There's not a single book in the Bible that was written about you, Philip. But every book in the Bible was written for us, right? And the reason why they were written for us is to point us towards God. Point us towards Jesus especially, right? So, as we get going, I want to start today by setting the context for Daniel. I really don't remember, Clint, how many weeks I have. As many as I need, really? So it's probably going to be about 12. Yeah, so to really dive into this and do it, maybe 10, including this one, 10 or 11, 12. And then quit. And then when y'all get tired of hearing this ridiculous accent, y'all will kick me out. Okay, cool. So let's review the historical context of Daniel. And I want to remind us again one more time that this collection of books, letters, histories, poetry, all of that in the Bible, that collection, it's all the exact same story, right? It's all the story of Jesus. That's what the Bible is really about, right? It's about Jesus. It's about God's love for His creation. You, me, back through history and back as long as the future is going to go. That's what it's about. And about the redemption plan that God put in place before the first creative utterance, right? And so all of this stuff has been in place for the whole time. Old Testament, Jesus is coming. Gospels, Jesus is here. New Testament, Jesus is coming back, right? It's all the same story. So, Genesis 1, in the beginning God created everything, right? And then He created man and woman, breathed life into them. The Imago Dei, right? The image of God bearers on earth. And then Genesis 3, right? They decide to rebel. Satan tempts, Satan lies, all of those things. So they fall, kicked out of the garden. And then we have that long history and we finally get to the point where there's nothing good. Every single thing that was done on earth was evil and bad. That's what the Bible tells us, right? And I'm not going to go off on a segue. I almost did. I'm just not going to. I'm going to stay on task, right? So, nothing good. And then we have the flood and Noah, and we have the salvation of God's ultimate creation, which is man, the Imago Dei. Then we have Abram to Abraham, the promises. Then we get to the point where not even a nation yet, but Israel gets into Egypt, like a sojourn in Egypt, where they're saved from the famine that was going on in the land where they were living. And then finally that turns into slavery. The Pharaoh that was there when they first got there is long gone. The other Pharaoh, I don't know, you people turn them into slaves, and off we go. And then we get to Moses and the Exodus. Then we get to Mount Sinai, the law being given. At the same time that the law is being given, and everybody says, oh, it's the Mosaic law. No, it's God's law given to Moses, right? It's really important to remember that sort of thing, right? And at the same time that the law is being given to Moses, Aaron gives in and they build the golden calf. I mean, it's immediate. That's almost immediate that they begin to dive back into idolatry. So, 40 years in the wilderness. Not a single one of that generation that came out of Egypt got to go into the promised land. Not even Moses, right? Because Moses didn't get to see it. And then we get to Joshua. And I read the book of Joshua as I was doing all of this, and that's a fun read. It really is. Joshua's a fun read until you get to about Joshua 13, and then it's like Deuteronomy. You start getting all of the descriptions of things like that. So, about 1406, give or take, right? I mean, the estimates vary greatly. I mean, we're talking ancient history here, right? About 1406 BC, God orders Joshua to send them across the Jordan River. All right, and here's how he said to do it. Do it exactly this way, Remember, you're going to, the Levites are going to be carrying the ark. They're going to stop in the middle. The waters are going to part. They're going to go across on dry land. They do stones in the middle, do stones on this side. Remind us of people, it's a covenant, all of those things, right? So that's how they start. But remember that before that happened, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh wanted to stay on the other side of the Jordan. That becomes very important, right? That does, in the history of the nation of Israel. But they wanted to stay over. But they go across, let me see if I'm forgetting anything. They conquered the land, right? All the way down through. They left some people in place. They didn't quite do it exactly the way God told them to do it. Shocker, right? And then you get to Joshua 13, chapters 13 through 21. 13 through 21, and you see how the 12 tribes of Israel are to divide up the land. So you've got Gad and Reuben on the east side of the Jordan, and a half-tribe of Manasseh over here. Now, Manasseh is huge. And then the rest is divided up as you see here. Simeon, Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Dan, all the way up. Right? So 12 tribes of Israel, but there's only 11 divisions up there. What's missing? Say it again. The Levites. What do they give to the Levites? What does God give to the Levites? Do you remember? Say it again. Well, a job, yeah, but they got certain things. Well, they got a tenth of everything else, but they are also given specific cities. Remember, at the same time when this was all done, they set up also the cities of refuge that was in the law, right? That if a person accidentally did something, and they could run to this other city and sojourn there and not be prosecuted, and they stay there for a time, and then they can come back. So cities of refuge. And then to the Levites were given some other cities in there. Right, so you can read through Joshua and have a good time with that. All right, so, boom, here's the nation of Israel in the promised land, living in houses that they did not build, reaping harvests from crops that they did not sow, all of that stuff that was promised. And here they are doing that. And the judge system was set up, way before. Right, Moses was a judge, and come back. But here we are, and during this time, we have judges but no king. Is that correct? Judges, but no king. Is that correct? That is not correct. The king is God, right? So the king is God, no earthly king, right? So everything that's happening around here, everybody else, and we're going to get to that here in a little bit, they all have kings. And so Israel starts to think, you know what, we are less than. You know, they're starting to think we are less than all the other nations around us, so we need a king. Y'all know the story of that, right? We don't need to go through that whole story because, you know, that will take until January. But so we're not going to do that, right? So they started the kings. And then we get, oh, please. There we go. So then we get to the point where we have a divided kingdom. So about 1406 BC is when Israel crossed the Jordan, went in and started conquering. And it was about 930 BC, give or take. I mean, some of these estimates they vary greatly, right? But when you start getting in here, you start getting some biblical timelines that really start to make sense. So about 930 BC, we have other kings. We had King Solomon, right? So if you were to go and look, and I'm going to read this right now. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 11 through 13. And he says, "Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this." What did he do? What did Solomon do? Do you remember? For one thing, he took a lot of wives from foreign nations. So he brought in wives from foreign nations around them. They brought in some of the paganism, idol worship, that they were doing, and he started doing the same thing. So, what? The wisest man on earth, right? I'm struggling so hard not to go down that rabbit trail that I wanted to go down, but I'm just not going to do it yet. If I have time at the end, we will. But that didn't help. Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And then if you go over to 29, verses 29 through 39, in the same chapter of 1 Kings. Now it happened at that time when, and I'm not gonna be able to do these names as well, but Jeroboam, I think that's correct. Now it happened at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet the Shilonite met him on the way, and he clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to you, but he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh," anyway, all those different gods, right? So what happened was, let me make sure I have this right. So 10 tribes of Israel, God gave to Jeroboam. So 10 tribes of Israel. Let me go back. So what happened was this, right? So the 10 tribes, Reuben, Gad, let me make sure I have that right. Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, half tribe of Manasseh, and then the northern tribes, right? From just north of Jerusalem up, went with Jeroboam. And then in the southern kingdom of Judah, you had, let's see, let me go back just a minute. Yeah. So Judah and Benjamin, along with the Levites, that's very important. Judah and Benjamin, let me go back one, boom. So Judah and Benjamin, right here, that's it. Judah and Benjamin, along with the Levites, stayed with Jeroboam, right? It was like a descendant of the one that God said was the son of David, right? The Jeroboam, right? Yeah. Rehoboam, that's correct. So they kept Judah, and in that they had Jericho, Jerusalem, the temple, the priests, all of that, right? So Judah had all that. And because of that, Jeroboam, who was the king in the north, right? King of the north, king of Israel, he set up his capital in Samaria, but he built a sanctuary near Bethel. And they almost immediately began worshiping idols out of there. So, and Judah also fell into the sin of paganism and idol worship, right? Now, all of this, none of this happened in a vacuum, right? There were other nations, other empires along the way. So I'm going to talk about two of them because they're important to the book of Daniel. So this is the Assyrian Empire, right? And it actually started about 2600 BC, right? So long before Israel came out of Egypt, long before Israel crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land and set up the kingdom. So long before that, you had the Assyrian kingdom, right? It's really broken up into 4 phases, and this has the most important 2 phases of the Assyrian Empire. It actually started way up here in 2600 BC, and then you had the early, the old, the middle, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, right? And then you had a post-empirical Syrian nation, right, that kind of fell back in on itself back there. The greatest power that the Assyrian Empire levied that they had was during the right at the end of the Old and throughout the Middle Assyrian Empire, and that's about 824 to 671 BC. That's when they were at their most powerful, and they were powerful indeed. They had incredibly strong armies. They had incredibly strong discipline and all of those things, and they were awful human beings in this empire. When they talk about, it was the Assyrians, right? It was the Assyrians that started the practice of crucifixion. The Babylonians made it a little worse, and the Romans perfected it, right? And so the torture that they would do to people was just incredible. So when you think about the Assyrian Empire, when they came down and started to take, this part of Israel and a little bit of Judah in here, when they took them captive, it was not a pleasant thing, right? So that is the Assyrian Empire. And then a greater empire arose, and that was the Babylonian Empire. A magnificent empire with all kinds of art, culture, and all of those things. And the Babylonian Empire went from about 1890 BC to about 224 AD in its final form. When the Babylonian Empire began, you see, hard to see. So here is the Euphrates River, right? And here is the Tigris River, right? So we should be very, very familiar with all of this area, especially today, of all the wars that we've been fighting since 9/11. Most of that has taken place right in here, and then, of course, over in Afghanistan. But this is Iraq, right? So it was basically Iraq, and this is where it started, and then it went up, and they began to clash with the Assyrian Empire almost immediately. See, this is all of that. And so they began to clash with that Assyrian Empire, and this is where they finally ended up. And you notice that Egypt, Judah, Israel, Babylon, we're talking about almost into Turkey, right? And then, but what did they run into when they got over here?
Greek states.
There you go. Starting to get towards the Greek state, right? And they ran into the Hellenists over there, and it got difficult for them. Go ahead. Question? Somebody had a question so far?
Land versus water.
What?
Land versus
Oh, yeah.
Defending islands versus realms.
Yes, absolutely true. That was a very big deal, and I don't want to get into all that, but thank you for that. It was a very big deal. So, but eventually the Babylonian Empire was beaten, was taken over by the Medo-Persians, right? The Medes and the Persians. So that's a big deal in our story in the book of Daniel as well, right? So, with all of that, we go into the Israel captivity. So turn with me to 2 Kings 17, around 56. That's not right.
How old is your brain?
17, 5 and 6. I'm sorry. I can't read my own notes. So, beginning in about 740 BC, let me go back one. Beginning in about 740 BC, under King Pul, P-U-L, and you can look in 1 Chronicles 5:26 talks about that, but it talks about the fact that the Assyrians began to take over Israel. And the first tribes that got taken into captivity were the half-tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. Those were the first ones that were taken into captivity and taken back to Assyria. Now, when they say Israel was taken into captivity or Judah was taken into captivity, they took most of them. And they took like the promising, I don't want to say this, I'm going to say this wrongly, who they viewed to be the promising, the wealthy, the intelligent, all that. But they left people in place to farm and mine and do all of the things that they wanted them to do, basically in slavery, right? And then about 722 BC, the capital city of Samaria, right? So the capital city of Samaria was taken, and that pretty well was the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. So about 722 BC, and that's where we read that 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6. Now the king of Assyria, and his name was Pul, went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. Then, in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, in the city of the Medes, right? So, that was when, boom, they took them away. And then right after that, about 21 years later, the Assyrians raided south into Judah. And then the Assyrians came south into Judah. They took most of Judah, but they never took Jerusalem. The Assyrians never took Jerusalem because God didn't let them do it. He didn't want them to do it. So they never took, the Assyrians never took Jerusalem. So going back, do you remember in what year? In 626 BC, Nabopolassar became king of Babylon, and by the time of his death in 605 BC, he had overthrown Assyria. So by 605 BC, Assyria was no more. Well, they were back up into that little bit, and that was when you had the Neo-Assyrian Empire, right? So it was about 605 BC, and about 605 BC, Babylon inherited. So Assyria was sieging Jerusalem, had Jerusalem under siege, and about that same time that the Assyrians got beat by the Babylonians, so the Babylonians, if you will, inherited that siege of Jerusalem. So, now we're there. So 605 to 586 BC, there were several different times. To 605 to 586 BC, they began taking Israelis, Jews, back to Babylon, back to different places in Babylon, and setting them up and having them do things for them. And again, they left a remnant, they left people there to farm, to mine, to fish, to do all of the things that they wanted to do.
Pat,
Sir,
I think that's a big deal.
what's a big deal?
That remnant
Oh, it's a huge deal.
We're going to get into this Daniel story, how remarkable it is that he makes it through all this, because the other 10 tribes from this point on are lost
Gone.
to history.
That's right.
This is the 10 tribes of Israel, who the whole Old Testament is about up to this point, and they're, you can read that, you can read further down into Kings where we were just at, but because of their disobedience to the Lord, they disappear from human history
Oh, yeah.
at this point.
And then, yes. So the remnant
That's
that...
how serious the situation is.
It's very, very serious. I should have said it that way, but I didn't think you... But I mean, they're gone. The other 10 tribes, that half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, gone from history, right? Just gone. Never heard from again. And so all we have, Judah and Benjamin and the Levites at this point. That's all that's really left, right? So, I'm trying to get through this history, but about this time, so Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian emperor, right? He was the king of Babylon, and he put Zedekiah. So he appointed Zedekiah to be the king over Judah, right? He was a vassal king, right? He put him in place there. I didn't write the date down, but it was about 537 BC, give or take, that Zedekiah, so he joined other countries, Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Phoenicia. And if you can picture what that might be, if you think Phoenicia, right? So they all began to plan a revolt, a rebellion against the Babylonian Empire. And once they did that, then Nebuchadnezzar came down, overtook Jerusalem, completely destroyed Jerusalem, right? Destroyed the temple, Solomon's temple, destroyed all of that, took most of the stuff, all of the very important things, right? Candles and, all of the things that are described that went into the tabernacle, then into the temple, took all of that stuff and took it back with him to Babylon. Took it all the way back with him to Babylon, right? And then that was about 537 BC. About 587 BC, 587, 586, somewhere in there, BC, right? Not exactly when, but think about this for a second. So from that point until May the 14th, Scott, I wasn't going to get that specific, 1948, that Israel it did not exist, right? The nation did not exist under its own authority. I want to say it that way, right? I mean, they were always there. This area was always there, right? But they were occupied by every single kingdom that came down the pike until 1948, when after World War II, and it was reestablished as a nation for the Jews. You agree with that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that's incredible.
I'm not sure that the UK ceding that over is really an authority.
Well, yeah. But I mean, yeah. So, I don't want to get into politics. I'm just going to completely stay away from politics if I can. But the other thing is, there's no such thing as a nation of Palestine. It has never been a nation of Palestine. So all of that is very, very important, right, to this story. So, turn with me to the book of Daniel now. It's really hard to say, and it doesn't really say how old Daniel was. So the estimates were anywhere from 12 to 18. But when you read in the third year, in the chapter 1, verse 1, let's just go a minute. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now, I could have just read that instead of that almost 45-minute history lesson, but I think we needed to get a little depth into this as we begin the book of Daniel. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted, blah, blah, blah. Right? I don't mean to go blah, 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 God's word, but that's what I wanted to talk about, right? So that word that they're using in there, in Hebrew, that word means more than a child, right? But less than a mature man. So anywhere from 12 to 18. I don't know why. Maybe it's because Jason said it, but I tend to think that I tend to go with the younger age. I kind of think that he was about 12 years old. And everything that I've read, and if you put that timeline together, Daniel was taken in the first wave. Daniel was taken in the first wave. Off he went to Babylon.
And if you work backwards on the timeline,
Yeah.
you know he's still an official by 538. He's still working.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean he's got that job for around 70 years.
70 years.
So that puts him, a human lifespan. Obviously, he's young enough that he can make it 70 years without.
82, that kind of makes me think, so that's kind of why. 82 to 85 when he died.
But he's also got to be old enough to remember his.
That's right.
What?
Everything that happened. Because he was in the middle of all of that turmoil, right? When Jerusalem was besieged and Chad, off the top of my head, I can't remember the historian, the Roman, Josephus, thank you. Brain dump. So if you were to read Josephus, you can see what a siege in this time frame would have been like. Back in the ancient days, what a siege would have been like. It was horrible what that siege was like. So he got to experience all of that before he was taken away and then taken into the castle, right, of Nebuchadnezzar. So it doesn't say it in here, but it's kind of implied in that very first thing. The king told the chief of the eunuchs to take them and do these things with them. It's kind of implied, it doesn't say, but I think that Daniel and Meshach, I think they were all made into eunuchs. I can't prove that. It doesn't say it anywhere that I could find, but I think that is true. I think that's a supposition on my part, but I think that is true. And then the last thing to know is he never went home. He spent 70 years-ish in that place doing the things that he did along with his friends, and he never got to go home. So he died a Babylonian captive. So another very important thing that happens in here is that the Medo-Persian Empire, which I didn't get a map of that because it's not that important to the story, but the Medo-Persian Empire rose up and destroyed or conquered the Babylonian Empire, and that's where we get King Cyrus. And in about 538 or so BC, that's when Cyrus started letting people go back to Judah, right, the southern kingdom, right, and they went back to Judah and began to rebuild the walls, the city of Jerusalem, and eventually the temple. So, what do we take away? Go ahead.
One little detail that comes to mind in there is that Jeremiah,
Yeah, oh yeah.
when he was before Judah was finally captured by the Babylonians,
Yep.
Jeremiah prophesied that they would be in captivity for 70 years.
70 years. Exactly right.
Then someone from the north would come and destroy Babylon.
And destroy Babylon. That's right. So, I mean, it's all tied in together. And it's amazing.
Timing was on God's time.
Always.
Because if you read verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim
The Lord.
into the hands of the people.
That's right.
It's just when he allowed it to happen.
When he wanted it to happen.
So
Right.
it's hard for us to comprehend.
So the question is why? Always the question is why. So why did God not want Jerusalem to be conquered until until that time? Why? Until that time. McDonald's.
He wanted the word.
Oh, Whataburger better.
He wanted the word to be
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. I don't know. I hadn't figured that out yet. So,
We don't know God's ways sometimes, but we might never get to know that.
well, maybe it was because Daniel got old enough that he could remember everything before they let him go.
And I'm a history buff too.
Yeah.
It's always interesting just to read all this stuff and then just sort of sit back and think about all this coming into play from many directions and what happened, like with the Roman Empire, all the spread of it
Oh, yeah.
and the ease of living around in a Roman world when Christ was crucified and all that. It just makes you go, you know.
Well, we'll get into that. We're going to get into that when we get into, when Daniel, when God gives Daniel the means to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We're going to get into these empires and what they did and all of that, right? And you get a better insight into why God did it this way. So kings. The one thing that I always take away from these, like the Old Testament studies to me, and how that applies to us today. Because as we look at this, I've titled this, and I've stolen this title because it's a really, really good title for this book. But it's going to be Daniel, right? Men of character and prophet. So we're going to look at this book in these two different ways. We're going to look at these men of character. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And Daniel, and I cannot pronounce the name that they gave him. So I'm not even going to try it. So, and Daniel. Say it. Belteshazzar? It's a funny thing, right? So I'm always going to think this. When Hunter was a little boy, and we're telling the story of Shadrach, Meshach, but he would say, Shadrach, Meshach, and a billy goat, because Abednego, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I always think that whenever I read it, but it's, but the things that they did, the way that they had to live in that Babylonian kingdom. But they never were of that Babylonian kingdom, right? And so every time I read these things, and I think about that. That's where we are now, right? We live in this kingdom, this nation, and it's as fair a nation as has ever been on the face of the earth. But we're not of this kingdom, right? We have a king. Our king is God, right? Our king is Jesus. That's our king. But we have to live in this world, but we don't have to be of this world. So as we look at these passages where we talk about them being men of character, like at the very beginning, not eating these foods and drinking the wine and doing those things, and not bowing down to these other images of gold and doing all of these things, I want us to remember how that applies to us today. And I want to do that. And then we're going to break down the prophecies, and we're probably going to get into some arguments about some of these, because you get into some pretty strong eschatological discussions, and I don't mean our individual end times, I mean end times. Like what is it referring to? And it's going to be fun. We might get a little heated, and that's okay. We all love each other, and we're all going to be fine. Cool? All right. Thank you all very much. I could have let you fellowship for about 3 more